Yes, Ms. Richards.
Ms. Barlow, the questions are going to range from topic to topic because they come from a range of different sources, so we may dot around from subject to subject for a while. The first question arises out of the statement of Mr. Evans, which I think you've seen. He says in his statement, and I can put it up on screen if it would assist, but it's very short. He says that, as well as saying you had in many respects a more difficult job to do than your predecessor, Mr. Harvey, he tried to press you to soften your style because some board members and some beneficiaries were not used to your, what he describes as more business-like approach. Do you recall any conversations with Mr. Evans along those lines?
No, I actually don't.
Next question is requires us to look at a document CAXT 40/110_008. This is a report by you to the board, excuse me, of the Caxton Foundation, and it describes in the second paragraph some members of the Contaminated Blood campaign group arriving at the offices and being allowed to proceed onto the first floor by main reception. First of all, is it correct that the Caxton Foundation had previously had an open invitation to beneficiaries to take potluck and visit Alliance House when they wanted?
Not that I was aware of, no.
Were you actually present in or in the presence of those who you describe entering Alliance House? Did you see and interact with them?
I was in a meeting with Charles Lister at the time, as it says.
So the description that you put in this document of them effectively barging their way in and putting
that
staff
was recounted to me by other staff.
So not something you yourself witnessed?
No, as I say, it was recounted to me by other staff, including our auditor happened to be on the premises at the time as well.
And then you say in the last sentence of this paragraph, it subsequently become clear from information passed to me from other sources that their intention was to shock and intimidate staff and that they enjoyed doing so. What was the factual basis for that assertion?
Someone copied me in on an online post.
Were you aware that those who were involved in visiting the offices, did they, in subsequent partnership group meetings, try to correct your or your colleagues' understanding of the nature and purpose of the visit?
I don't recall.
Did they ask you to remove your account of the visit and accept that they had not been inclined or intending to behave or did actually behave in the way that you describe?
I don't recall them making that request, no.
Because a question which I've been asked to ask, which I think I may have asked you yesterday, but I may not have done, so I'll ask it in any event. I asked you about the Department of Health reference group, I think yesterday afternoon, and what that was. Were Caxton Foundation board members on that reference group as well as Mcfarland Trust board members?
Yeah, there were representatives from all 5 Alliance House organisations at board level on that group.
Did you ever commission any kind of customer satisfaction survey at either the Mcfarland Trust or the Caxton Foundation to find out for yourself what those making applications or receiving assistance from the organisation actually thought about them?
Not that I recall.
And was any consideration ever given to doing that, given the references we've seen in the documentation to there being concerns about lack of transparency, tone, and so on?
I can't remember, I'm afraid.
How much money remained in the Caxton Foundation at the point in time that it closed?
I'm afraid I don't know. I can't remember the figure.
Do you know what happened to the Caxton Foundation monies, such as they were? That were left?
As I recall, they were returned to the Department of Health.
Want to go back to you on the question of household expenditure. Can we have MACF 40153_028, please? We looked at the income and expenditure form. Before we look at it again, you'll see that this is this particular application was an application for financial assistance towards a motability scooter. So it was a grant application, yes?
Yeah, it looks like that, yes.
Okay. And if we go to the second page, we can see the household income and expenditure form clearly asks for information about the partner's earnings and contributions from other household members. Mm-hmm. Now, I had originally understood your evidence to be to accept that the household income, rather than just the applicant's income, was taken into account for the purpose of assessing grant applications. But your later evidence suggested that that was not the position. Which is the case?
Yeah, no, I'm not sure. I didn't think we looked at partners' net earning for grants, but I may be misremembering.
Would you accept this form clearly looks for partners' net earnings and indeed contribution from other household members in the context of a grant application?
Yeah, but I'm actually just wondering whether this was the application where it said that someone didn't want to provide their income and expenditure statement?
Yes.
I'm wondering whether this is actually the statement that was prepared for a census as opposed to the actual grant application form.
Okay, so you're not able to assist us?
No, I mean, as I say, my recollection was that we didn't ask for household income for grants. It may be that due to the passage of time, I've remembered incorrectly, but my recollection, if this is the same case we looked at earlier, that this case was this not passed on because the person didn't want to complete an income and expenditure form? It
was said that it was not possible to determine charitable need in those circumstances.
Yeah, and so what this might be is actually the staff providing the financial information that we did have.
I don't think it is.
Would be if this form had been for the person's census for regular payments, then that would have included the partner's earnings as well.
I don't know if that has...
As I say, without knowing what, being able to see all the paperwork, but that would be my guess. I don't recall asking for partners' earnings for grant applications, but I may have misremembered due to the passage of time.
Is there any help to be gained from the fact that this is dated 19th of March 2015? If we go back one page, please. The GC date is the 2nd of July. So it may have been the same application possibly, but it might not be. I don't know. You can help.
No, well, I think the fact that... is it possible to scroll down a bit further on this covering sheet?
Beneficiary contacted
yes,
contacted us in March 2015.
Says,
so that would fit with the March 2015 date for the form.
Yeah. No, it says here, as the beneficiary is refusing to complete the income and expenditure form, that's why it's been sent to the committee. And so, my guess would be that the income and expenditure form is taken from the individual census because they haven't, that would have been the latest income and expenditure information that was available, given that they didn't want to fill out the form.
Not sure that can be right, Ms. Barlow. If we look at the paragraphs on the top of the screen, it says the beneficiary contacted us in March 2015 and was asked to complete an income and expenditure form. In June 2015, we received an email from the beneficiary expressing his anger at having to complete an income and expenditure form. The beneficiary did not complete the form in full, but has matched the total of his expenditure to the income. And so the document that's on the second page is precisely what's described there. It's him not completing or her not completing the form in full, but matching the total of expenditure to income.
I mean, to be fair, I think we're just speculating here because we haven't got all the information. As I say, it later goes on to say, as the beneficiary is refusing to complete the income and expenditure form.
I think.
As I say, my recollection was that we didn't ask for partners' earnings when it came to grant things, but I may have misremembered that.
Well, what may help may be the absence of any query in the text here, because this is an internal note about the application. The top paragraph, the beneficiary then contacted us in March 2015 with his request and was asked to complete an income and expenditure form for his request to be considered. So that suggests that the office thought that they had to ask him to complete an income and expenditure form. We may have been wrong to do so, but that's what they seem to have done. And they then get an email. That's what they describe, as getting an email back expressing anger at having to do so. He didn't complete it in full. It matched the total of his expenditure with his income. So the form attached looks as though it's the form which is the income and expenditure form referred to in the first paragraph. Is that not a sensible way of reading this email, this document?
Well, as I say, but the fact that it then goes on later on to say the beneficiary was refusing to complete the form.
Yes, refusing to complete the form in full.
I don't know.
And if we look over leaf, go back to the form. We see in handwriting, the bottom of total expenditure, a figure which looks like 22,000, is it? 352? It's difficult to tell.
What the individual said he did in the emails that are part of this document is he simply matched the two figures. So he put in the expenditure form the income form because he took the view that was all the information the trust was entitled to.
Yeah. So he's done what the text describes, which is he's filled in the sources of income, and he said my expenditure is exactly that.
Yes.
Yeah. That's what it looks like. I think at the moment, unless I get some other explanation, that I think is what I'm bound to conclude about this.
We'll see if Ms. Barlow's unable to assist further on that. No doubt we may be able to pursue it further with other witnesses.
I mean, there may be something else that comes to mind later on, which helps. But otherwise, as I say, that's where I think this evidence, internal evidence, is leading me, which would then also lead me on to the conclusion that you have misremembered, and that in fact, when it came to the grants, at least for a period of time, that applicants were expected to fill in this form.
Yeah, as I say, if that's the case, then I've misremembered that.
You said in your evidence this afternoon that there wasn't a close relationship between the Haemophilia Society and the Mcfarland Trust. Why was there not a close relationship, in particular because the Mcfarland Trust's refusal to campaign might have meant it all the more important to associate with a campaigning organisation?
Yeah, I'm not sure really. I mean, as far as I'm aware, the Haemophilia Society, if you like, its beneficiary group, the majority weren't people who had been infected. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer to that is. That's obviously something that's been the sort of situation that had developed over a number of years.
Do you accept that there should have been attempts to establish and maintain a close relationship between the two organisations?
Well, I'm not sure how much our agendas overlapped, really. As I say, my understanding was that the majority of the Haemophilia Society's beneficiaries weren't people who'd been infected.
We spoke earlier about the office guidelines, Ms. Barlow. Given that the office guidelines had tariffs, of sums that were presumably considered to be reasonable and appropriate for the item in question, why was it necessary for applicants still have to provide 2 quotes?
Because the figures that were given in the office guidelines were, if you like, a maximum. And I think, as I answered in one of my previous questions, we got 2 quotes and we almost always went with the lower quote. So the actual cost might be lower than what the maximum in the office guidelines was.
Was 1 quote and the fact that you had your tariff not sufficient to enable you to assess the application in a way consistent with the Trust's objectives?
Those were the rules that were sort of set by trustees, and that was the rationale that I understood for it.
And then moving on to the dispute with the Haemophilia Society following the meeting with Ms. Cowell and the publication of the Haemophilia Society's letter, was it your view then, and is it your view now, that expending funds on solicitors and the prospect of litigation was an appropriate use of monies that were therefore registrants of the Trust?
As I said, we had no choice. It was a big reputational issue for the organisation that had to be addressed. We attempted to resolve it informally, and that wasn't possible. But you cannot leave those kinds of false allegations sitting there to do all kinds of damage to individuals in the organisation.
So,
it was regrettable that the money had to be spent, but I'm not sure that the board had any other course of action.
So the answer to the question then is that you do consider it was an appropriate use of funds, or even though those funds were there for the benefit of registrants, rather than the reputation of staff?
In the circumstances, there are costs involved in running an organisation. And unfortunately, in those circumstances, that issue had to be addressed.
I asked you, I think earlier today, about the provision made for bereaved partners and spouses and its adequacy. And in your answer, you noted in part that bereaved partners and spouses didn't have haemophilia or disabilities.
On the whole.
Yes, so some bereaved partners were disabled in their own right, or incapacitated potentially in consequence of the psychological and physical burden of caring for those who had been primary beneficiaries. Was that recognised and understood at the Mcfarland Trust?
Yes, I think it was, and so bereaved partners and spouses were able to access grants for things like adaptations to homes and mobility issues, as I recall.
I asked you earlier about the issue of Caxton and Mcfarland user trustees, again without mentioning anyone by name, please. Is this right that the Mcfarland Trust had, at least at the time this issue was being considered, up to 3 people who might be user trustees in the sense of being either beneficiaries or associated with beneficiaries through family links? The Caxton Foundation ended up with only 1. Did that strike you as reasonable and sufficient to ensure beneficiary representation in board decision making, in particular bearing in mind that the Caxton Foundation had a much larger number of overall beneficiaries?
Essentially that was the organisation's boards had been constructed in different ways. As we've discussed, the 3 user trustees on the Mcfarland board, in the early, for a long period of time, they were nominated by the Haemophilia Society, and similarly, as I think we've also discussed, for a long time, the Department of Health nominated trustees to the board of the Mcfarland Trust. Those, if you like, specifications weren't made for the Caxton Foundation.
I asked you earlier about the bequests, the Wilson Fund bequest and the Honeycomb bequest. Were there any other bequests of which you were aware?
No, not that I can recall.
Were you aware at the time you were Chief Executive of the purpose of those bequests?
yes, but I'm not sure I could tell you what they were now, I'm afraid. I've forgotten.
Were the sums kept separate from the main funds received from the Department of Health?
They were treated as restricted funds and accounted for separately.
I'd asked you earlier about loans in relation to the Mcfarland Trust. Are you able to assist with this? What happened to loans secured against property when the beneficiary died?
I don't recall. I'm not sure as I can recall an example of that happening during my tenure.
What about unsecured loans when the beneficiary died? Were steps taken to recover those?
I think, as we discussed earlier, there was only one completely unsecured loan, and that was the one that was written off towards the end of before Mcfarland was closed.
I had asked you earlier about the issue of campaigning, and one of the matters you raised in response was to say that the Department of Health had put a cap on staffing. How had the department put a cap on staffing?
I think that was a condition. I don't know how far back that went, but the department at some point had determined how many staff the organisations in total were allowed to have. And as I said, we talked yesterday about funders putting conditions on funding, and if you like, that was one of the few explicit conditions that the Department of Health put.
Did you, or to your knowledge, the board of either the Mcfarland Trust or the Caxton Foundation raise with the Department of Health the fact that those staffing constraints prohibited or constrained the organisation's abilities to campaign?
I don't recall.
Do you recall there ever being any discussion with the Department of Health about staffing levels?
Not in relation to campaigning or anything. No, I mean, the discussions with the department were usually around, I think we covered something earlier where we had to submit a budget for staff and premises costs in advance each year.
Then in relation to the MFT's practice of calling on its reserves in part to make up a shortfall, was that used only in respect of grant allocation or top-up regular payments, or both?
It was across the board.
You referred earlier in relation to the Caxton Foundation to there being money from the devolved administrations, which was a percentage contribution. In relation to the Mcfarland Trust, were there also monies received from the devolved administrations via the Department of Health?
Yeah, I believe so, but that was always an internal issue at the department, and we weren't made aware of that. We weren't made aware of how the 2.2 million was broken down between the 4 UK countries.
And did you have any dealings with or accountability to the health departments of the devolved administrations?
We had some contact with them, but we always reported effectively through to the Department of Health, so the English Health Department.
There's reference in various documents to the Charities Commission. Did you have any dealings with or accountability to the Office of the Scottish Charities Regulator?
Not that I recall.
One of the last questions I asked you before we broke was about fitness for purpose of the Alliance House organisations, and you responded by saying that you thought they were fit for the purpose they'd been set up for, which was the vehicle of disbursement of funds to the infected community. What about the dependent and bereaved communities? Did you understand that to have been part of the purpose of
that
the
was,
establishment.
Yeah, that was, if you like, that was an omission from my answer, that it was, set up for the purpose of dispersing funds to the people that, the infected and their spouses and dependents.
Did you consider the Alliance House organisations to be fit for purpose in the way that you have used that term, for the purpose of meeting the needs of the dependent and bereaved communities?
In the sense that we were there to channel funds to those who had the greatest financial need, then I believe we did that with the funds that we had available.
Given the history that you have in part related of applications to the Department of Health for increased funding on a number of occasions, what can you recall was your reaction to the announcement by David Cameron in March 2015 in the aftermath of the Penrose Inquiry report that there would be an extra £25 million for the schemes?
I don't recall specifically, but clearly it showed that there was a way of, that the government could decide to make more funds available.
Had you and your colleagues on the boards of Mcfarland or Caxton, or indeed the other Alliance House organisations, had advance notice that funding allocation was going to be made? Not that I recall, no.
And actually, the bulk of that money was channeled through, if you like, the not the charities. So the only sort of new payment that was made as a result of that money was through the charities was the £10,000 payments to the bereaved partners and spouses. So the bulk of that money wasn't channeled through the charities.
That I think you've anticipated what my next question was going to be, Ms.
Okay.
Barlow. No, thank you. Which was going to be what proportion was allocated to Mcfarland and what to the Caxton Foundation?
Yeah, no, I mean, as I recall, the bulk of that money went in the introduction of a new regular payment for people at Skipton Stage 1, and to increasing the regular payments for people who are in receipt of MFET and Skipton Stage 2 payments. And then, as I say, there were new £10,000 payments to bereaved partners and spouses. And I think originally the department possibly thought that those could also be channeled through Skipton and MFET, but actually it was the charities who had the regular contact with the bereaved partners and spouses, not the charitable companies. So that was why that money ended up being paid out through the charities, as I recall.
Did that additional allocation, given that it was the bit that came to the charities was used for the purpose you describe, did it have any overall effect on the position with regard to the funding shortfall and the continued rundown of reserves?
No, because it was earmarked very specifically for one-off payments for bereaved partners and spouses.
Now, I asked you earlier about engagement with the beneficiary community, both in relation to the Mcfarland Trust and in relation to the Caxton Foundation. Do you accept that it was open to you to institute a better system for engagement with the beneficiary community in addition to the partnership group, or in substitution for the partnership group when that founded at Mcfarland Trust?
I guess the Mcfarland Trust might have done that, but I think everyone was aware that there was this history of the partnership group starting up and then closing and then starting up and closing. And I imagine, I can't remember the detail, but at that time we were probably waiting for the partnership group for beneficiaries to decide they wanted the partnership group to restart.
You said earlier when I was asking you about the process for grant applications, and again applies to both Caxton and Mcfarland, that there were, as far as you recalled, only a few cases where it was a problem having to procure two quotes. Was any effort made to understand the extent to which the two-quote system deterred applications, which you wouldn't then have known about?
No, but I mean, we made very many grant applications through Caxton, in particular, because that was traditionally, certainly in the early years, that was where the method through which the bulk of funding was dispersed. As I said, there were occasions where, for example, if someone lived in a remote area, it just wasn't practical for, there weren't enough tradespeople, for example, for someone to get two quotes. And in those cases, we accepted that. But, the staff team usually discussed applications with people. So it was normally some kind of two-way process when people were making applications.
We've heard some evidence that at least in earlier years at the Mcfarland Trust, some applications for financial assistance were made through or with the assistance of a social worker or clinician. Was that something which you were aware of still happening when you were Chief Executive at Mcfarland and the Caxton Foundation?
Yeah, I think there were examples of individual cases where people had support of social workers, but as far as I was aware, not everyone had, there weren't, if you like, specialist social workers in all parts of the country. So that wasn't an option that was open to everyone.
And did going through a social worker or doctor, as opposed to applying solo, make any difference to the likelihood of receiving financial assistance?
No, I mean, it wasn't taken into account per se, I don't think. I think sometimes if people had that additional support with an application, it might have made it clearer, there might have been more information available, but I can't recall the details.
Could we then look at MACF 5028_018, please? These are the minutes of, or part of the minutes, part B of the minutes of a meeting in January 2018 at the Mcfarland Trust. But before I direct your attention to the relevant part of the minutes, can you assist with this? We see minutes of the boards of trustees being divided into two, part A, part B being the private and confidential part. What were the criteria for determining what would be included as part of the private and confidential minutes as opposed to the publicly available minutes?
As I recall, the private and confidential minutes typically included discussion about members of staff or terms and conditions or policy stuff that was in development before it was finalised and ready to be made public.
Discussions with the Department of Health, would you expect those to be in Part A or Part B of the minutes?
It would depend on what the nature of the discussion was.
Why would any part of the discussions with the Department of Health need to be maintained as private and confidential?
Because they might have wished to share with us some of their thinking that was in the early stages and asked us not to share it publicly at that stage, for example.
Okay, and then if we look at the heading Mcfarland Trust Reserves Grants Programme, little paragraph 1, it says JB advised that the team had heard from various sources that beneficiaries were intending to boycott the grants programme. And then if we look at and there's reference to some saying that the form was too onerous. But then if we look at the last sentence of that paragraph, there had also been questions as to why MFT couldn't just share out the money equally between all beneficiaries. But this was not possible because of the requirement to assess charitable need. Was that the advice that you were giving the board, that it was not possible to share the money out equally between all beneficiaries?
I can't remember where that advice came from at this stage.
Was any legal advice obtained on this issue?
I think there was some legal advice as to what the organisation was required to do with its funds on winding up, but again, I can't remember the detail at this stage, I'm afraid.
If this records the advice that you were giving, would you regard yourself as being properly qualified to give advice that sharing out money equally wasn't possible?
As I say, I can't remember where this advice came from, but there were very specific requirements in the trust deed as to what had to happen. I mean, that's a standard clause in trust deeds as to what has to happen with money if organisations are wound up.
To what extent did you or the boards of either the Caxton Foundation or the Mcfarland Trust attempt to communicate to beneficiaries your understanding that there was your understanding of their dissatisfaction with the system for financial support, their dissatisfaction with having to come to, as it were, cap in hand to a charity? Did you attempt to explain to beneficiaries that you understood their position?
I think at things like partnership group meetings, I think we did, and I think in the information we, for example, made available, say on the website about grants and why we needed certain things, I think we attempted to explain why we were asking for the information that we were asking for.
You said, again, when I was asking you about fitness for purpose of the Alliance House organisations, they were fit for the charitable purpose for which they were established, but not to fulfil the purpose beneficiaries wanted them to fulfil. Did you ever communicate your view to the Department of Health that they were not fit for the purpose beneficiaries wanted?
I think, to be fair, the Department of Health was very aware of that.
But did you communicate it or discuss it with the Department of Health as far as
I'm sure we did discuss it at meetings, yes.
And would that have been in the annual review meetings?
Probably, and at other ad hoc meetings.
Was there any consideration of the reserves, the Mcfarland Trust reserves, going to the Haemophilia Society?
I don't recall. I recall that the decision as it was when, at the point at which I left the organisation, was that they should go to the Terence Higgins Trust.
Do you think that there should have been a positive consideration of funds going to the Haemophilia Society?
I can't remember what criteria we were using, but I think, as I said, there'd been a partnership with the Terence Higgins Trust, and in the past, and the Terence Higgins Trust did offer services to people with HIV, and yeah, there were a number of reasons I think why the Terence Higgins Trust was considered.
Returning to the question of campaigning, you gave evidence yesterday and today that there were not the resources for campaigning because of the funding constraints that the Trust and the Foundation experienced. Was there ever any analysis of the longer or medium-term value of campaigning or fundraising? The cost-benefit analysis that work now might involve costs but have a good longer-term payoff?
No, not as I recall. And the other factor was also this staff cap, where, as I said, essentially the combination of the funding, the limited funding, or the staff cap meant that it effectively channeled the work of the Alliance House organisations into activities associated with dispersing the funds that the government made available to us.
I've asked you about the processes for grant applications or applications for payments and whether they were onerous. And I think the effect of your evidence, in part at least in your written statement and orally, was that you thought the processes were broadly in the middle compared to other charitable application processes. Was there ever any assessment of whether there should be particular adjustments or reasonable adjustments to the Mcfarland or Caxton's processes, given that the very purpose of those organisations was to meet the need of beneficiaries many of whom were physically or mentally disabled?
Well, we tried to assist people on a case-by-case basis if they were struggling, and I think I've probably referred to it in my written statements that staff would actually sit on the phone with people and fill in the form for them. They would help point them in the direction of getting quotes. We would make allowances if for whatever reason someone really wasn't able to get more than one quote and things like that. So I think we did try to respond in that way.
That's on a case-by-case basis. My question was a more structural one. Did either Mcfarland or Caxton ever ask itself or assess whether, given the nature of the physical and psychological problems experienced by Minnie, there should be adjustments to the overall processes to make them more straightforward and easier, rather than simply assisting on a case-by-case basis as and when requested?
Well, as I say, we did a piece of research at Caxton early on to try and understand how our requirements compared with those of other organisations, and I think we felt that we were on the sort of a less demanding end compared with a lot of similar organisations in the amount of information we were asking for in support of grant applications.
Mr. Evans, in a letter in March 2015, so this is in the immediate aftermath of the dispute with the Haemophilia Society, said, and I can put the letter on screen if it helps, but he said that the long history of good relations between the Mcfarland Trust and the Haemophilia Society had deteriorated over the last 12 months. Were you aware of there having been a deterioration over the preceding 12-month period, and if so, what the causes of that might have been?
No, I'm afraid I don't recall the specific events.
When decisions were being taken as to what should be done with the Mcfarland Trust's reserves, was consideration given to what was being done by the Eileen Trust, which was proposing to share its reserves out amongst its beneficiaries?
I'm not sure whether the Mcfarland Trust was aware of that.
Did it occur to you as Chief Executive to make contact with the other Alliance House organisations and find out what they were doing?
Well, I mean, I knew what Caxton was doing in as far as the monies had to be returned to the department, and the same applied to Skipton and MFET. I think if you like, some of the advantages for the Eileen Trust was that they had a smaller number of beneficiaries, and I don't know the detail. I've just understood that they'd made grants to those individuals, and they had considerably less. Well, the thing I do know is they had considerably less residual funds to disperse.
What was your understanding at the time, or what's your understanding now, of the proportion of those people with haemophilia infected with HIV who were also infected with hepatitis C?
I mean, I'm sure I knew the figures at the time, but I couldn't tell you what they are now.
The charitable objects of the Caxton Foundation were to support people infected with hepatitis C through blood products. Mm-hmm. But those who were co-infected with hepatitis C and HIV, who were haemophiliacs, were not permitted to access the Caxton Foundation and had to apply to the Mcfarland Trust. Is that your understanding?
That's correct, but I think I've said in my written statements, to my recollection, there weren't any new primary beneficiaries during my time at Mcfarland. So the people who were co-infected were Mcfarland beneficiaries already, who were already getting support.
Okay. Was any?
And that was determined by the Department of Health. That was the Department of Health policy.
Do you know whether any consideration was ever given by you or the Board of Trustees as to whether that was discriminatory or unfair to exclude those with HIV, those who were co-infected and therefore had HIV as well, from Caxton?
I'm assuming the Department of Health took legal advice on that itself before it set the Caxton Foundation up.
You've described that your interaction with beneficiaries was, I think, largely through the partnership group, your own direct interaction with beneficiaries. Were you discouraged by either the board of the Mcfarland Trust or the board of the Caxton Foundation or the Department of Health from having a more direct relationship with beneficiaries or meeting with them?
Not that I recall.
When we talked about the office guidelines earlier, we discussed the question of financial maximums. Were there any time limits on applications for assistance?
I think there were, but I can't recall what they were. But as I said, one of the things about the office guidelines was if someone didn't fall within the requirements set out in the office guidelines, a grant application for the same thing would still be considered by the board. Sorry, by the committee.
Okay. Final question, I think. On the assumption, please, that household income was taken into account, so overall household income was taken into account when assessing grant applications, rather than the applicant's financial position alone. Do you think that was fair?
Well, as I've said previously in my evidence, the organisations had to channel the resources they had at the people in the greatest financial need. So getting a complete picture of people's financial situation and the affordability of what they were asking for was part of that process.
It's not quite an answer to the question, I think, Ms. Barlow. That okay. You explaining why financial constraints led to that being the position, if it was the position.
Yeah.
My question is a broader one. Do you think it fair that families effectively had to, or might be expected to, pick up the cost of expenditure that was a direct consequence of infection through blood or blood products?
Well, I think the issue was that the Mcfarland Trust was there to channel money, extra money over and above what people received through MFET and Skipton, to those in greatest financial need. And in order to be able to do that, we had to understand what people's financial position was and whether they could afford themselves what they were asking for. And as I think I sort of gave an example yesterday, that, if someone with £1,500 disposable income a month is asking for, I don't know, something that costs £500, and someone with zero disposable income is asking for something for £500, and you have to choose, then clearly the person with £1,500 a month disposable income has the means to afford that item. So it wasn't a value judgment about whether it was fair that people should do it. It was a question of what was the trust there for, and the trusts were there to channel money to those people in greatest financial need, and we had to, there had to be a way of trying to assess that.
So those are the additional questions I'm proposing to ask from the questions put forward by core participants.
Yes, well, I've got just a couple of questions for you, but the first set of questions really needs to be put in context. What you've given to us is a clear understanding that when you came in 2013 to the trusts, the trust and the foundation, this was the position that, so far as Mcfarland was concerned, there had been complaints from beneficiaries about the communications and the way the staff had communicated with them. You had trustees threatening to resign and clearly very unhappy about funding and in disagreement amongst themselves of a pretty dramatic sort. You yourself identified significant failings, that's the description you used, in the way in which regular pay had been made, especially to widows. You couldn't do what you wanted because of the staffing cap. The partnership group hadn't been operating. When it did, You knew from what you were told that it operated on a rather spasmodic basis, depending upon if anyone could be prepared to chair it, and the chair, the first example you had was the chair, after a couple of meetings, fell out with others over the minutes. As far as the Caxton Fund were concerned, the beneficiaries knew they could get grants, but they weren't being told what they could get grants for, and they weren't getting regular payments. And the exceptional circumstances criterion was the sole grant criterion for Caxton, and that's not a grant criterion that found much favour with you. So you must have wondered, I suspect, what sort of hand you'd been dealt, because I'm sure you didn't necessarily anticipate that that would be the position when you joined. And I suspect it didn't get an awful lot better because in 2015-16 you had the APPG report, which was pretty critical. And after that you knew that the writing was on the wall for the organisations that you were chief executive of, and they were duly wound up very shortly after this inquiry had been announced. I think you went on till October 2018. You did have a success with the lobbying of the department when it came to the proposed changes in benefits and payments to the infected. But when you left, did you have any regrets about leaving that organisation in those circumstances?
I mean, in what sense?
Well, did you think when you had to go finally in October 2018, oh dear, what a pity, or did you think, my goodness, that's a bit of a relief?
What, for me personally?
You personally?
I mean, I'm not sure I thought either of those things. I think, you know, when one does a job like this, you have to a certain extent, roll with the punches, and you have to adapt to the changing circumstances. And as I said earlier, I felt that we all tried to do the best that we could in the circumstances that were there at the time. And there was a long period of uncertainty, as you've identified, sir, from 2015, where there was talk of merger, there was talk of procurement, all kinds of things, were on the cards for a number of years. And we operated we had to carry on operating and, providing funding to beneficiaries with all of that external noise, if you like, going on all around us. And in the end, when the decision about procurement was announced, the decision to move to NHS Business Service Authority was announced, we'd been sitting waiting to submit a tender under a public procurement exercise. And so the whole time, the ground was kind of shifting around us. And as I say, for us, the important thing was to continue being able to support beneficiaries as much as we could with all that going on. But yeah, I mean, when I came to the end, it was a shame that we hadn't, we'd spent a lot of time, I believe, improving our offering to beneficiaries, even though some beneficiaries might not have felt that. But certainly it was a much more efficient organisation at the end from what it was when I found it. And that was, you can look back at board papers that show things like turnaround time for grants, instead of this situation where, things were taking months and months and months. Even grants that were being considered by the 6 weekly grant committee and NWC meetings, I think the turnaround time was, averaging 2 weeks at that point. So there were, I believe we had improved the system significantly. At Caxton, we had been able to introduce some form of regular payments, even though it wasn't at the level we had aspired to do. And I think, you have to try and continue to do your best, even in situations that aren't optimum. And at the point at which the decision was made that everything was going to be moved to the NHS Business Services Authority, well, from my point of view, it was like, okay, well, that's the decision, and this is at an end, and off I go on and do something else. So I'm not sure, in your question was, did I feel the one thing or the other? I'm not sure it was like that. It was a little bit more pragmatic, I think, by that point.
Well, perhaps I can ask it in a different way. Did you do you look back on your years at the Mcfarland Trust, your 5.5 or so years, and Caxton Fund with Foundation with affection?
I do, in many ways. There were enormous challenges there, which we've explored over the last couple of days. But in spite of, the picture that may sort of come through in some of the hearings, my team had some really, really good relationships with lots of beneficiaries. And, in another time and place, I would have been able to produce folders showing you all the thank you cards and letters that people used to receive, the flowers, the chocolates, the Christmas boxes that staff used to get sent from people who were really grateful and appreciative of the support they received. Sometimes, in my view, more grateful than they needed to be, because people were just doing their job. But it wasn't all negative, not by a long way. And I met some very lovely people, both staff, trustees, beneficiaries, and that's all part of the picture that one gets throughout one's career, really. So I'm someone who tries to take the positive out of situations. So I look back, with a certain amount of fondness at my time, but it wasn't without its challenges, as we've discussed.
And the final question is this: in one of the earlier documents that we looked at earlier on today, in respect to the Caxton Foundation, there is a reference to the vision and strategy which needed to be introduced. What was your vision and strategy?
Oh, I'm afraid I cannot remember the detail at this point, but it was expressed in the annual accounts.
Well, but a vision is a vision. I mean, you can't articulate it now. What you were trying to hoping to achieve, what you saw the future of the Caxton Trust as being.
I'm afraid I just can't remember at this stage, sir.
Very well. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Richards.
Ms. Barlow, do you have anything further that you would wish to add?
No, thank you.
Well, it remains for me to thank you. You've had particular challenges of timing, and I'm sorry that we've detained you later on in this afternoon than you had anticipated or even wished, and you've made really very little of a grumble about that. So thank you for that. You've given us a good picture of how you did your job as the chief executive of the Mcfarland Trust and the Caxton Foundation in the 5 or so years which ended, as I've said, just as the inquiry began. I suspect that some of the questions weren't always easy, and I imagine you might be the first to acknowledge that it's a pity that you had so often no actual recollection or couldn't remember what the answers might be, or what had actually happened, or the reasons that the board might have had for what they did, or why they didn't do what they might have done. But nonetheless, your evidence has helped us to develop a fairly clear picture of a lot of what happened with the Mcfarland Trust and the Caxton Foundation after 2013 and before ultimately it was morphed into the EIBSS. So thank you for all that.
So tomorrow, 10 a.m, the evidence of Mr. Roger Evans.
Yes, 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.